And just to get things started, I will ask you the same question I ask all of my guests the first time they join me for this. Who are you?
Wow, big question. I'm a person who I think since an early age I've been driven by a quest for some kind of meaning and understanding of, same questions we all ask. Why are we here? Why are we in these circumstances as opposed to some very different ones? And I think when I was probably in my teens, that found some traction in books that I got introduced to by older friends like Alan Watts, the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. Remember, that was a big impact. The Catcher in the Rye. I could identify with Holden Caulfield's, sense of confusion in a world that was, a little overwhelming, but at the same time, he felt a little more savvy than some of his peers.
Yeah.
Those were books that had an impact on me. And then Herman Hesse books, a little bit later. So I probably was in my early 20s when I discovered Carl Jung, and that was a kind of a clincher for me because he spoke more or less directly to the kind of intuitions that I'd had, but I never encountered anybody that spoke about that so directly.
Yeah.
So if you ask me who I am, I have to say that, I didn't really start becoming conscious of myself in terms that were articulate in the way that I've striven since then to embody in my writing and in my songwriting and so forth, until I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. Before that, I was just kind of groping in the dark like a lot of people, but I think it's that quest for understanding probably that I would say defines, the essence of my personality, like a lot of other people. I don't feel alone in that respect or special. I think, in fact, I think because of the pressures in the world that we live in now, particularly with this pandemic and with a lot of the uncertainty about what bears any kind of authority in the media in terms of truthfulness and reliability, a lot of people have been sort of jolted out of the complacency they may have been living in before and are being almost coerced into asking these kind of questions that maybe you and I've been asking since we were troubled young people.
Yeah, no doubt.
Is that good enough for a
I think that's a great start. And I think just for logistical purposes, what's your name? Where are you from? What do you do?
Paul DeFatta, born in Shreveport, Louisiana, got out of there as soon as I could. The night after I graduated from high school. I 64 years old. I've been a professional singer, songwriter, musician, doing cover tunes as well since I was in my early 20s, so it's a while. That being a performer, a musical performer, was being an introvert. I had to cross a few little, Rubicons to get, off and running with that, but it suited me, and it's given me a lot of freedom to travel, to live in places where, I'm able to kind of expose myself to different cultures. That's, for me, travel is a big part of, my own education, because when you are able to leave, your native culture and live somewhere where people live in an entirely different worldview, use different concepts, a whole different language history to make sense out of their experience. When you go to a place like Bali or Peru and you spend 6 or 7 months there and you try to learn the language and connect with people in places like that, that experience itself is extremely humbling, because you just see what a cave, like a Platonic cave,
yeah,
you've been dwelling in, most of your life, until suddenly you come into a different kind of culture bubble. But the biggest shock for me was coming back from Indonesia. I was, I think I was 42. I think when I went, it was 99 when I went to Indonesia, and I spent about 8 months traveling. And I learned a little bit of the language and when I came back to the United States, that was the biggest shock, because I realized I'd sort of objectified in some ways the terms and the conditions of the American, cultural experience by getting out of it for a while.
Right.
Of course, I was a babe in the woods when I was there. In a sense, I felt in a lot of ways kind of crippled and handicapped because these people were operating on a culture matrix that was totally familiar to them, and I was an outsider.
Right.
So when I came back, and I just saw how I don't mean to insult anyone, but a lot of my well-educated friends, just suddenly I saw the myopia of the cultural, assumptions that had gone unquestioned. So
Yeah.
travel, huge part, I think, of what I would say has been my education as a human being.
Yeah, and expanding your perspective, like what you're describing is a perfect sort of summation of the reason why I named my channel The Outsider's Perspective. Experiences that take you outside of your, like you said, myopic little world and show you that there's more beyond what you thought was the entirety of your reality. Those types of experiences, those experiences are extremely valuable. And it's interesting to hear different people that I've spoken to over the years, whether it's through traveling, through psychedelics, through different methods, meditation even, you can get yourself out of your own perspective and outside of it. And to me, that's one of the most valuable experiences we can have as human beings.
It may be the decisive experiences, that mature us. Because I can't really imagine, I can't imagine going back. I can't imagine going back into the little chicken egg, that I was in, that I had to break out of in order to get here. It would, so I think there are these moments of decisive expansion that happen, like you say, with their psychedelics, with travel, education, meditation, relationships. Any relationship that's going to reach deep into you is going to challenge, those knee-jerk, reactions and assumptions that we operate by, before we get broken open. But getting broken open is the key. And
the dark night of the soul is another common one that I know a lot of people who had to go through medical problems where they were told there was no solution or this is the only way out, and that was the moment that forced them out of their usual mode of operation and forced them to go beyond what they thought was normal or acceptable to seek a remedy or some kind of solution to the problem. And so It really does seem to be a breaking open, doesn't it?
It does. And Jung talks about that it's only when we enter into these, and what he calls an impossible situation, like you just described, and there's no rational or obvious, kind of trajectory out of it. It's in the collision, I'd say, of all those, impossible variables that something transcendent is born.
Yeah. And I think you touched on something earlier on as well with the pandemic. I think the pandemic for a lot of people is like this kind of collision that you're describing. And maybe for a lot of people, it's the first time they've ever had this kind of experience. And it's happening on a mass scale, which is pretty mind blowing.
Yeah. Do you feel sometimes like you're able to, kind of tap into, maybe a kind of a collective mood, a collective, state of fantasies that are in a response to a situation like this? Because if you are, then you're kind of on a similar wavelength with me. Because when COVID pandemic started, I felt like it was like a paradigm shift that was underway, and it was forcing a lot of people who had just been kind of on autopilot before in terms of their daily routine, their professional and family lives, had a kind of undisturbed structure to them. And all those habits, all that directed libido on a collective level just hit a huge wall. And I think understandably, a lot of people just flipped out because it was just such a colossal, interruption of the flow, right? But I saw around me friends of mine for whom this was a big effect. I could see that they were really stressed by this. They slowly started to adapt. They started to work remotely. They started to, they went through a period maybe of intense paranoia about the impact of, the virus itself. And then things began to simmer down a little bit. And then I noticed now that a lot of people have kind of recalibrated. To these different terms and conditions that were introduced by the pandemic. And it feels like a kind of almost a collectively forced introversion.
Yeah.
before, at least in the United States. I can't really say how this would apply in other countries right now, but I imagine something kind of similar happened in places that were really extroverted and outer directed in their energy,
Yeah.
flow, like the US, where it forced people to kind of turn in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the same in Canada too. I mean, I have
Is
lots
it?
of friends. Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting, and I want to find out how you've coped with it, how you've dealt with the pandemic and adapted to it, and whether it was hard or not. But for myself, I think I was like prepared for this already, and being pretty.
Temperamental? You mean temperamentally?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like
Yeah.
I adapted to it very quickly. I'm also a homebody. I'm
Yeah.
not especially social in terms of like going to concerts or going to the bar or anything. So, but I had a
Yeah.
lot of friends who struggled because it's like, it seemed like the thing that kept them going through the slog of daily life were these escapes to the restaurant, escapes to the movie theater.
Yeah.
And when those possibilities were taken out, all that was left was the slog. And I know a lot of people who had a really, really difficult time
Yeah. Yeah.
because for them the daily life is a slog. And I think the reason for me it wasn't so difficult is because for the last probably 8 or 9 years now, I've been trying to make my life a spiritual exercise. So like whether I'm answering emails or doing the dishes or all the mundane things, I'm using those as an opportunity, or at least when I'm at my best, I use those as an opportunity to
Sure.
be more present and to really take notice of all the little details and things instead of being like doing the dishes and thinking about what I'm going to do after I'm done. I'm doing the dishes.
Sure.
So for me, it was a pretty easy adaptation. I'm having a harder time now with all of the divisiveness, and you said tapping into the collective moods and stuff. I really feel the schism that is happening with people who are, say, for example, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, pro-mask, anti-mask. And as someone who stays kind of in the middle and who likes to observe and keep my mind open and just kind of take in data and go with the best decision I can make at the time, it's very difficult because it's like you're either with us or you're against us. You're either, if you show any hesitancy towards the vaccine, you're an anti-vaxxer. And if you get the vaccine, then, well, you're a pharmaceutical, you're just a shill for the pharmaceutical companies. It's like people don't have room for shades of gray these days. And I don't know if you've noticed a similarity in your neck of the woods, but I have a hard time with that.
Well, we had Trump, before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And that was, just as divisive here.
Yeah.
And like you said, there was no middle ground, no shades of gray. All the arguments seemed to be, reduced to bumper sticker kind of slogans. And people were, it was much more heat than light, and I think the same thing is carried over into the pandemic situation. And I have to, I'm skeptical because I've studied a little bit about deliberate efforts on the part of mass media to basically to exacerbate tensions around controversial issues like abortion here it used to be, and like Trump was here, real lightning rod for really passionate divide between values and even unconscious personality types. It's weird. Like, a lot of people that supported Trump that were family members and friends, I never would have suspected it because it seemed, and I don't mean to, dwell too much on Trump, but it's like any of these issues that we're talking about, whether it's vaccination, or, what to do about immigrants or whatever. It ultimately taps into stuff in people's the foundations of their personality that normally they don't have conscious control over these things. And the media seems to have people working for them that know exactly how to drill right into that shit and stir it up. And so I don't know how much of this phenomenon that we're seeing in terms of the polarization and the noisy, rancorous, political and value related divisions would be like this if they weren't being stoked all the time, and it's obvious that when you have a mass population and you can't control them with weapons like you could in the old Soviet Union, you got to do it through mind control.
Yeah.
And when Noam Chomsky's talked a lot about this, and there's a famous documentary that was made by two Canadian, documentary filmmakers. I forget their first names, but they did Manufacturing Consent about Chomsky, and it's fabulous. It talks about this, about how in a mass democracy like this, ostensible democracy, then you can't use force, like you could in totalitarian regimes that were built on, authoritarian power like that. You have to do it basically through entertainment,
deception, conditioning, brainwashing,
and basically, reduce people, both through the so-called educational system, and through, knowing how to, in a calculated way, hit these points, these nerve endings, that are somehow tapped into unconscious passions that are irrational but extremely overwhelming once they get excited, and then just keep at it, relentlessly, without any kind of detached reflection, but what you see happening in the news lots of times are just partisans of one side or the other. So they just kind of like are the foreground or fourth stage ringleaders of the stuff, and everybody kind of falls in line. And you see that going on with the pandemic right now too, as well, I think. So it's hard to imagine, getting out of this impasse sometimes when you think that these are the mechanisms that are operative right now, and not enough people are seeing through it.
Yeah, and that's the key. You're totally right, because if it wasn't the pandemic, it was Trump. Before that, it was Black Lives Matters versus Blue Lives. There always seems to be some issue or issues dividing people along very oversimplistic lines.
Yeah, some dichotomy.
Yeah, exactly. And as soon as one is resolved, or it becomes less of a hot topic, like you said, the nerve is a little raw, or maybe you've just adapted to it, they switch to something else, and then they start poking that one. So that becomes the issue now.
Yeah.
And so how much of your background and your interest and your study of people like Jung and Nietzsche and those types of individuals, how much of that has helped inoculate you against some of those types of tactics, really? Because that's what they are, that the media uses to kind of, make people go a little crazy.
Well, enormously, because, both Jung and Nietzsche are, psychologists without peer. They just, who knows where, that those insights came from that enable them not only to see, but then to somehow articulate in ways that have reached, millions of readers like you and me, and helped us to kind of develop some of their own techniques and tactics for staying properly skeptical and suspicious, of the official story and what's happening in the foreground. But yeah, I mean, and that's a painful education. Most people, family members of mine have real strong resistances to that kind of skepticism, because it's going to disrupt anybody's comfort zone to start raising those questions, let alone pursue them at any, to any length. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned in your book Nietzsche specifically as having this effect of like he destroys everything that you believe in. He doesn't help you build anything up again, but he's like a tornado that comes through your belief system and kind of.
Yeah. So only whatever it can endure that kind of holocaust. I hate to misuse that word, but it is like that, a whirlwind, that comes in and just sweeps away everything that's not nailed down.
That's right.
And so what survives that is really what's worth keeping, or what deserved to last.
Yeah.
I hate to say that, but it's like, I wonder if the pursuit of these kind of truths that we're talking about doesn't ultimately come down to something like, well, I hate to use his aphorism because it's so overused. What doesn't destroy me only makes me stronger. But it's kind of like what isn't taken away and lasts is the only thing that's real, but, humans have always, and they always will, depend on certain kinds of necessary fictions or hopeful scenarios, because we just can't live, as creatures with this kind of consciousness we're not like animals in that sense. Animals are always regulated by instincts. So there's just almost immediacy between stimulus and response. With us, we've got this breathing space, this gap between stimulus and response, so that we can contemplate a variety of different alternatives. And that's what eats us up, sometimes, and causes a lot of people to suffer much more pain than a dog or a cat or a duck would.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, they suffer physical pain, but I don't think they suffer the kind of psychological
anguish,
or emotion. Anxiety. Yeah, exactly. Because that stuff is born in time, right? It's about fantasizing about the future or dwelling on the past. Animals, like that knowledge of the past is embodied, as you said, in their instincts and their survival instincts and all that kind of stuff, self-preservation. Yeah, we humans, I mean, it's like the thing that makes us so clever and adaptable is also the thing that seems to be our biggest enemy at this point in time,
Exactly. Yeah. That's why I kind of, I don't know, I read Dante late in my life, I think it was about 10 years ago, and I host reading groups. So we had like 10 or 15 people all reading it at the same time, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Yeah. And I came to the conclusion basically that human life in toto is kind of purgatorial. It's like it's like that. It's like a kind of place of probation where everything is continually being tested, and if your spirit is unable somehow to withstand the losses, the pain, the betrayals that come with just being a vulnerable creature with needs and self-conscious, in a world of other self-seeking, creatures like yourself, you're going to suffer damage that makes it really, really difficult to make it to the end, of your life. And so I don't see human life as essentially comic, or in the sense of, like a dramatic genre that things always turn out or even normally turn out for the best. I don't know if I'm ready to go to the point where I'd say it's tragic, because I think that there's this, like you're saying, it's like this is our crisis. We live in a kind of crisis zone because of self-consciousness.
Yeah.
And you can turn it off with drugs or with alcohol or with porn or whatever, but that's not going to eliminate the terms and conditions of human life. It'll just dampen them or deaden them. But if you want to stay alive and alert, it's a crisis.
Yeah, it's
and it doesn't stop. I don't think it's as long as you got a body and you love people, and that extends your surface area when you're married or you have children, like Francis Bacon said, when you get married, you give hostages to fortune, to fortuna. Wow. It's like you're basically turning it. But totally. And so.
Yeah, that's crazy. I never heard that quote, but that's exactly what it is, right? Because it's like you grow another heart. It's like you have all of a sudden now I have this whole other heart full of love for this other human being. I didn't think I could have more love in me, but now my baby's born and it's like, holy crap, I have this whole other heart full of love, but that person is not you. And they go out into the world with that heart and you're like, oh God, don't do that. Please don't, it's so tough. Right. Yeah. But, I read a book a few years back that made a pretty big impact on me called The Master and His Emissary. It's by Ian McGilchrist, and it's essentially about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, but it maps over into kind of what you're saying. And I think what it comes down to is like the mind, right? The mind is a faithful servant or a cruel master, as the old aphorism goes. And I think what happens is when the mind is in charge, the mind is essentially a problem-solving tool, right? Survival tool, keeps us alive, and it does so by solving problems like hunger, problems like there's a threat here. When there is no immediate threat and the mind is left to its own devices, it will create problems because all it knows to do is solve problems. So it's like sometimes you're laying in bed at night and you start thinking about stuff from like 10 years ago, and it's like there's the mind creating a problem for itself to solve, And it seems like the crisis mode that we're in is kind of, I feel like a lot of it is driven by this uncontrolled, unbridled mind. Like the mind is just in charge, the ego, the mind, and it's just creating problems for us because it doesn't know what else to do, right?
Well, what if, like, we were talking earlier about how animals inherit all these instincts directly from their own ancestry. They don't have the issue of having to learn over an extended childhood like humans do to acquire these things through culture. But what if, what we call the unconscious, right, is just packed with something like not necessarily the actual memories, of battles in Thermopylae or, naval disasters, on the Titanic, but it's like, what if, something like the echo of our ancestral experience is embedded in our brain structure. You can be materialistic or you can be psychic. You can these two different levels is working in parallel with each other, the psychic and the neurological or whatever. But I recently got married. My wife is Polish. She has been exploring the impact upon the Polish collective psyche of all the trauma that country has gone through, which, the United States has its share of trauma,
sure,
but some people more than others in this country, but in Poland, it
everybody,
and what happened with the Nazis and then later with the Russians and the Soviets, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so what she's interested in is how trauma can be communicated at almost a cellular level.
Wow.
From one generation to the next. So that it doesn't mean the actual memories, again, of being raped by Nazis or Russians or held at gunpoint and having all these things happen, in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
But it does mean that there's something almost in the genetic inheritance that is almost wired for that level of either violence or disturbance. That just can't be, it's not like we start off as little tabula rasas, blank slates each time. It's like there's a whole set of tributaries that are leading into you and me when we're born. And the culture is one layer of that, but it's relatively superficial compared to this deeper, substratum, that comes from God knows where. But we have some records to see how horrific, and exposed life was just 200 years ago.
It hasn't been that long since we've had this sort of level of comfort and safety. And I think you're right. I mean, I think
unless you were super wealthy and privileged,
right.
But even then, your life expectancy wasn't greater than probably 40 or 45 under the best conditions. So this is like an unprecedented bubble of either prosperity and security, and yet it's in the 20th century. It was pretty horrific on its own in spite of all that. So
well, I mean, and I think through studying people like Viktor Frankl and stuff, I feel like the fact that we've never had it so good is probably part of the problem, right? Because fighting for survival is not really a thing for you and I, right? I mean, we don't even have to look that far for our next meal. Which is, like you said, very different from the last, basically from all of our ancestors up until very recently. That was the norm. And so in the absence of this need to fight for survival or to find your next meal, we have spare time. And the mind is idle. It's not looking to solve these immediate problems that it evolved to solve for hundreds of thousands of years. The mind was there to keep us alive. And now keeping us alive is okay. That's not hard. It's easy for a lot of us. And so in the absence of this, the mind is like creating all these problems. And what you brought up is a great point. It's got a deep reservoir to choose from, whether it's your own personal traumas or maybe even deeper, some of these unconscious traumas that we've inherited. So left to itself, the mind is like looking for stuff to do. It's just getting into trouble, and it's creating all of this extra, all this extra suffering, it seems, because if you look at all the objective physical metrics, life expectancy, health, all these different things, wealth, we've never had it so good. And yet depression is at an all-time high. Mental illness is at an all-time high. It almost seems like these things are correlated inversely. Like the better we have it, the worse our mental health becomes. And it's because we don't have a deeper meaning or a deeper purpose to keep us anchored, it seems.
Well, I mean, another consequence of prosperity and of even the development of civil rights, where if you think about 200 years ago, our ancestors were mostly peasants, in Europe and other parts of the world, and they depended on each other in a way and to a degree that is really different for you and me and many people living today who people who have striven for individual freedom and independence from the kind of demands that people who lived in close-knit communities, serfs, slaves, people who were bound in an agrarian lifestyle, which was the majority of the planet, probably still is. It may be that the majority of people still live closer to the soil, despite the fact of industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. Or maybe just crossed a line, and more people live in cities now than they do on farms and in rural areas. But until recently in history, that was the norm. And I think because of that, there was a different kind of anchoredness because of the close-knit community relations that people had. They were smaller communities. They weren't, megalopolises. They were, little rural areas. But if you didn't know how to cooperate and, negotiate and give and take, in ways that I think are being lost now to people who are super individualistic. If you didn't know how to do that back then, you were either ostracized or persona non grata in the village, and you were messed up, And so I think that might be another aspect of modern life too, is that our social instincts have become in some ways shallower, maybe because of the rise of individual liberty, which is leading to isolation for a lot of people, and rather than deeper integration and a depoliticization of people, that they feel less need to be politically engaged unless it's hitting like or something on that's different, than getting out in the streets and so anyway, that's another consequence that I've thought about, is that we've become, I don't know, less adept at being social creatures because of this prosperity and the kind of isolation that it's leading to.
Yeah, it seems very
lives.
Paradoxical, right? Because it's like globalization, we're all connected, more closely connected than we've ever been to people across the planet. Even we can you and I are quite far away, but here we are talking face to face. And yet at the same time, we've never been more disconnected, and then on the other side, what I was saying earlier, we've never had it so good in terms of health, wealth, and those types of measurements, yet we feel so bored with life, or we feel like life is meaningless. And so it's very paradoxical to me that we're making all of this quote unquote progress, but it doesn't seem to be helping us psychologically at all.
No, you're right. And it's hard not to blame corporations and capitalism for some of this, because, I think it's obvious that a new kind of model for organizing human life has emerged from modern capitalism. And compared to religious and mythical and even nationalistic, as messed up as that can get, those kind of structures for organizing a people and for bringing meaning and value and a mythic structure to life, capitalism is pretty damn superficial, but it's effective because of the stuff we were talking about earlier, that it's almost diabolically, not almost, quite diabolically learned how to tap into the irrational needs, hungers, insecurities, fears of ordinary people, and just turned them kind of into, servants to a system that they neither understand, and certainly can't overmaster. They can't compete with it, because the people who are running that kind of machine, that system, they're just too clever, and they're already too, I think in most cases, too intoxicated with the power and the wealth that it's brought to them to really be able to realize this horrible consequences, not just for their fellow man, but for the planet, that come directly from this kind of hubris. And it is a hubris. It's kind of a, well, what is it? The sorcerer's apprentice. It's like a little fairy tale about the sorcerer's apprentice. He learns about this, either this magic device or a wand or something that gives him the power that the sorcerer has, but he has none of the knowledge about how to manage it.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like that.
Yeah.
We've allowed, we've opened Pandora's box
Yeah.
with modern science and technology, and we've unleashed a degree of power for our species, not just the people who are running it, but the ordinary consumer has such a huge footprint now in terms of the impact they have on resources and on, damage to the environment and so forth, that it's hard. You can't put this genie back in the bottle. I think people want to, they want to be optimistic and say that, if we stop now, if we, get a grip on, the, release of, these, gases and so forth into the atmosphere, maybe we can gradually turn things back. But I wonder, I think we might have reached a tipping point, and
it certainly seems that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've triggered some cycles, like we've triggered some cycles that are going to continue to operate even if we stop all emissions today. We've already triggered this cascading effect that's going to carry on. And so, yeah, I mean, we're looking at now having to reverse it. We can't just stop. We have to stop, or we have to find a way to reverse the stuff that we've done. And I mean, there's technology coming out, but again, like you said, technology in and of itself, or scientific understanding in and of itself, isn't the solution. We need, let's say, wisdom to direct that understanding.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, our intelligence and our cleverness has continued to evolve, but we have not become wise enough to manage those.
Our power.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfectly put. Yes, exactly. So we have all this great power and we have no wisdom with which to apply. Where should we use this power? How should we use this power? It's not a question of should we or how. It's a question of let's do it. Like, we can split the atom, let's do it. There's no question. There's no reflection on, well, wait a second, shouldn't we think about this for a minute? It's like, no, let's do it.
Carl Jung said that reflection was one of the instincts of humans, aside from sex and survival and hunger instinct and so forth, aggression and so forth, when you feel threatened. He thought reflection was in there as one of our innate attributes. And I believe that. I think that that's true. I think people have the capacity for reflection.
Absolutely.
It's just like, a lot of people have a capacity probably to pick up an instrument, but how many people have the discipline, to kind of push through the difficult stuff to get to where you can become kind of fluent, or, at home with playing the guitar or the piano or something, or a new language. But what I'm thinking is that, almost paradoxically, in order for science to make the advances that it did, if you look kind of like at the history of how science emerged out of, a Western culture that was controlled largely by a religious myth, Christianity, in order for science to gradually emerge from, the trial of Galileo is kind of summarizes it all, right? The authority of the church was, going to be compromised if Copernicus and Galileo were correct in this new vision, right? It was going to displace the authority of the Bible, and with it, the ecclesiastical authorities. And, whether you agree with them or not, they were right that it was going to create a huge, schism in the Western psyche, if we were going to move in that direction. And that's the direction we moved in. So when you start training and educating a larger and larger number of people to think critically and with scientific detachment about, the natural world, about human nature, it's only understandable that religious authority is going to decline, and human ingenuity, symbolized by Faust, the whole story of Faust that Goethe writes, is showing what can happen, when humans, like we were talking about, start to take control over their destiny in a way that they were unable to, both in terms of power and political independence before these modern developments. So when science starts to replace, Christianity and other religious, narratives, we kind of go back in some ways to the way things were for ancient Greeks, a pagan culture where ingenuity, and human and reason were in many ways elevated to a higher status than belief or faith, right?
Yeah.
That all changes with Christianity and the rise of Christendom and so forth. But now we've kind of gone back to a secular, kind of emphasis to life. And what Nietzsche discovered, among others, he's not the only, but he really, really kind of, I think, hammered this home, is that when you lose that backing of the religious authority, then the morality that it had been supporting also comes under suspicion.
Yeah.
So, and Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals attempts to kind of make sense of different forms of human morality. He talks about master morality and slave morality in that book, how they emerge as natural responses to different kind of conditions. In other words, not from a metaphysical or theological standpoint, but almost in an adaptive kind of, response to different kind of social and political conditions, biological needs, and so forth. And when you start doing that, and reducing everything down to what we would call a natural basis, which is the way of science, really.
Yeah.
When you
breaking
do
things
that,
down to its parts, right?
You basically have eliminated this cosmic, mythological, theological sanction for the values that the West had lived by for a couple thousand years. And that's another big part of the story we're in right now. And most people maybe haven't taken the time to look at how to track this path that led to this complex situation that we're talking about. But it's there. It's right there in black and white. If you look at how thinkers like Francis Bacon and Descartes, there were, architects of modern science. Bacon is the one who explores, inductive reasoning. He kind of outlines for the first time the scientific method. He didn't know a lot about mathematics, but Descartes comes and remedies that problem. He invents analytic geometry, and then he finds a way of mapping, Cartesian grid, of mapping physical motion, right, in a precise way with mathematically, sound terms and equations. So that goes right into Newton, who blows everybody away by being able to reduce the entire cosmos and
billiard balls
to a mechanical universe. And it all works. And that was operative when in 1969, when NASA put guys on the moon, and they knew exactly how to get within 25 feet of the target. That was all Newton. You didn't need Einstein for that.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing. I didn't know that, but I read it recently in a book called The Tao of Physics, and the guy was talking about how Newtonian physics still work, even though we know that they're not an accurate model of the way things are. We have
at a
better
deeper,
models,
subtler level. Yeah.
Right. Yes. With particle physics and things of that nature, we know, right, that there's no billiard balls. It's just energy patterns. But nevertheless, the Newtonian model is still effective at predicting outcomes in reality. So to me, that tells me that no model is ever going to capture. I mean, of course, it can't, right? By definition, a model can't capture everything that it is modeling, right? Exactly, the map and the territory. But my approach is always to switch between models based on the situation and the context, because it's like in this context, this model makes a lot of sense and it can teach me things that are useful. But it doesn't mean that the model is the reality. And I think there's a tendency for us to get lost in the models and forget that they're models, like you said, that they're mapped, not the territory mapped, right?
Yeah, that's the seduction of consciousness, really. You can only really understand and, map what you're conscious of. And there's a lot more that we're not conscious of than we are, And, but, it's just a lot more automatic for us to assume that, the furniture of our minds is adequate for, the whole picture.
Yeah, that's a bit of arrogance in itself too, right? I mean, for me in my journey, one of the most impactful realizations was the fact that I don't know shit. I had an experience of it. It wasn't intellectual. It was like I had an experience, and the experience basically disproved a bunch of my underlying assumptions about life. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know anything about happiness. I don't know anything about meaning. I don't know anything. Like I thought I had
Or
these
you
things
did, but
figured
it
out.
wasn't enough. You
Right, where
did,
it
but it
was
just wasn't
completely
enough.
wrong because the experience I had showed me the reverse of what I had previously assumed. And so that kind of started me, kind of like the effect that we're talking about with Nietzsche, where it was like a tidal wave. And there was just like a couple things left after that thing receded. And I was like, all right, start from here, I guess. Start building
Starting
up,
from
right?
my spinal cord.
Yeah, basically, it's like I know that I am, almost like Descartes, right? Except minus the part about thinking, because it's like, well, there's thoughts happening, but how do I know that I'm making those thoughts happen? Because a lot of the times they just pop up, and I had nothing to do with it.
Well, earlier you were talking about how the mind, when it's left to itself and it doesn't have any, big survival challenges to cope with, it seems to, fall back into this kind of like staged, wars, inside itself, like simulated combats with imaginary,
Totally
enemies and stuff like
arguing
that.
with your friend who's not even here, and you haven't talked to him in 2 years, and you're having
Right, right.
yeah.
So if that's kind of like a model, for the way that the mind works. I mean, now we're kind of moving into territory that, for me, I'm a cultural outsider, to Advaita, which is, non-dual Vedanta in India. But since I was young, that was another influence. I mentioned Jung and Nietzsche and Hermann Hesse and those guys. They're Western thinkers, but there were two Eastern thinkers that have really had a big impact on me. And one of them, Ramana Maharshi, who's another Advaitist that I discovered when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And then more recently, Nisargadatta. And, the perspective that they're coming from, to the extent that I can grasp this, is that, just like you're saying, the mind itself is a kind of, continual 24/7 spectacle, theatrical enterprise, which is really rooted in these pairs of opposites, all kinds of pairs of opposites, good and evil. You take your choice, male, female, conscious, unconscious, but it's the tension between these opposites that generates the show, the spectacle. Now, that's the nature of mind, according to Advaita.
Yeah.
And what the true self, yours, mine, everyone's, is basically just this light of awareness, but it's not personal. It's like this is what's so hard for egos to grasp, because really what it's saying, if you buy this, is that the person, Oliver, Paul, is really just an elaborate construct, that has been identified with by this light of awareness. And it's a kind of trick almost, like you become invested in your story. I become invested in my story. And we have this series of collected memories, right, that are strung together to create this identity.
Yeah.
And this identity has values that he stands for, and people that he supports, and people he does. Yeah. But it's like a drama, and you're in it, and other people are interacting with it. And it creates this palpable sense of immersion in something that is totally real. But from the Advaita standpoint, it's just a fucking illusion that's going to be over. Yeah. It may be over before you die, but it's definitely going to be over when you die. And then you're going to be going, what the heck was that? And I know that sounds hard for, it's hard for me to grasp. And I've spent, 30 or 40 years trying to let it sink in, but sometimes it clicks for me. And when it does, it is revolutionary when I look at the mind from this standpoint. So what the question that I'm taking from what your description earlier about, sort of like the self-attacking nature of mental phenomena when you just kind of don't have anything pressing that you're concerned. Yeah. I think that they agree with this picture that you said. And I think that when you look at it that way, then it seems like the only real alternative is to learn how to be still and to watch that instead of being lured and seduced back again and again. And this is what meditation is, obviously. For some people, I think it's a way of detaching or disidentifying with the spectacle of Paul DeFatta, or Oliver, or whoever, and let it just kind of watch it like you're watching a movie. And but then you're going to have a million people come back and say, oh, how irresponsible, how morally outrageous it is to relinquish the one thing that you have some kind of involvement, moral obligation to uphold. But if you take this stuff seriously, and I have at times, sometimes I'm on the fence about it, but when I have taken it seriously, it makes even morality and picking the side of the good against evil a little questionable. Because even if you win that war, if it's true that the mind is composed of all of these polarities and opposites, it's unwinnable. It's Absolutely. Like its nature is to always be kind of self-canceling in a weird way.
Yeah.
And if okay, yeah.
No, you go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I feel like I kind of set it up, and now I want to see what you think about it.
You just made me think of something that Ram Dass said. In his book "Be Here Now," he talks about like hippies make the police make the hippies, right? And as soon as you partake in the polarity, you're contributing to the other side. Absolutely, you're playing the game, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's possible to realize that it's a show, to realize that it's let's call it a play, for example, and to see that what you're doing is just a role, but to still put in an impeccable performance. That's kind of what Epictetus says in one of his writings. He says, put in an impeccable performance. So he acknowledges that it's a show, acknowledges that you're playing a role, but you still have a responsibility to play that role while it's there in front of you, right? And so to the people that you were saying who would say, well, how could you abdicate this? And, this is like the one thing that you have. It's like, you can, and in fact, knowing that it's a role allows you to play it well, right? If you're an actor and you don't know you're acting, that's going to be a rough show. But when you know that you're playing a part and you understand what that part is, and you have some conscious choice in how you play that part, you're going to knock it out of the park. You're going to have a much better performance, don't you think?
I agree, and I think that probably Epictetus and other Stoics probably all would agree that there is this inner self, or there's a light of conscience that would guide that path towards impeccability.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just sort of like a postmodernist constructed life, of I think I'll be this per day, or
exactly.
I think it really, there was something that was like a stable flame of inner guidance for Epictetus that he had discovered, and that informed his writings.
They all talk about it. I mean, and this is something that I found in studying things like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, and then the Stoics and the Taoists. They all kind of talk about this indwelling thing, whether it's the Atma, the Logos, something inside each and every one of us that is transpersonal, right? Transcends the personality, is beyond the personality, or maybe below the personality, more foundational, the field of awareness, right? And anything that is in that field is not the awareness itself. So anything that you're like, I am this, I am that, as soon as you add something after the words I am, you're not that, right? No, you are the I am, you are the awareness, the field of awareness, and everything else that you attach to it is just part of that role or that narrative that you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. So, okay, I want to talk about your book, because we are talking about your book. I've read many passages in here that touch on some of these points. So what led you to want to write a book? Because you're a musician. Had you written a book before?
No, this is the first thing I published. I've been writing, 40 years. I started journaling when I was in, 18 or 19. And just as a way of just kind of externalizing, my inner life, so that I had some kind of document and I could kind of track things, as writing in a journal every day. I could track themes and see where things develop. I write dreams down sometimes and try to unpack them, personal relationship stuff, try to sort things out. But then, I was reading the whole time and reading philosophy and Carl Jung and stuff. And so I would find ways of dovetailing theoretical insights from my reading or knowledge I was gaining from literature, correlate it, with things that were happening in my life. And I think out of that is where essay writing came. They were basically elaborate, journal entries. And, I think it's about probably 8 years ago, maybe, that I started posting
Mhm.
short essays or aphorisms on my Facebook page.
Yeah.
And I'd been sending essays to my friends by email for years, and I got a okay response, but it was pretty tepid, compared to what started after about a year on Facebook.
Yeah.
Somehow or another, maybe I was posting things on some of the Carl Jung pages, some philosophy pages, and I was gathering some like-minded friends who were into these same themes and so forth. So it was out of that, really, that the idea of producing a book came, because I was getting encouragement from readers, saying, you got to think about reaching a wider audience if you can, than Facebook,
Yeah.
by putting a book out. So that was the incentive. Yeah.
Nice.
Now I've got 2 other books planned that are going to be much more focused on particular, arenas of thought, like one on focusing on psychology,
Yeah.
and one more on philosophical questions. But this book, Serious Play, is, all over the place. It's built around, just basically trying to provoke and or incite thinking about particular topics and questions, rather than to resolve anything.
Yeah. Well, and I think in asking some of these questions, you inadvertently help people resolve things. I mean, to me, I find that asking the right question is oftentimes more important than finding an answer.
Sure.
Like the answers, it's like sometimes they don't really help that much, but asking the right question, that's always going to be helpful.
It puts you on track. It puts you on a track.
Absolutely.
And the track might just keep going,
Yeah. And that's what I love about Socrates, right? His whole method. Like I've started using this in my own life. Instead of arguing with people, I just ask questions. Instead of trying to convince somebody or hit them over the head with a point that I want to make, just ask them questions. And oftentimes they come to that point on their own, one question at a time. You just kind of lead them there, and not deliberately, but just asking the right questions is such a hugely important skill in life. And it's
Absolutely.
one that people don't see. People are focused on the answers, right? And they don't really think too much about the questions oftentimes.
Well, questions are engaging, for one thing.
Yeah.
Statements and assertions, they don't always, they might invite a response, but they don't always, produce the kind of fire, the good questions do. That saying by Plutarch, the mind is a fire to be lit rather than a vessel to be filled. And I think that, when you live in a world where everybody's asserting things, it's like the vessels fill up pretty quickly. But if you start asking the right questions, it really gets the flames start spreading a little bit.
Absolutely.
Different way of looking at it.
Yeah. So these journal entries that you've compiled into your book, are they from, like, what's the time span approximately? Are they from the last 5 years, 10 years? Are they from your whole time journaling? Like I see a bunch of these in the background here. Are those all your journals from the last 40 years? And did you pull from all over the place?
You mean behind me here?
Yeah,
these are published authors. I've got I guess it's 148 journals filled at this point. And I use these little moleskins, like a lot of people use this same kind, but
yeah, and just fill them right up.
There's like 240 pages in there, and I go probably about 3 months is what at the longest, and I fill that up.
Yeah.
But the ones that go into Serious Play probably extend back over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
But
it's such a cool window into your mind, and it also kind of gives you insights into different things you were going through at the time. Like there's lots of stuff in here about relationships. You talk about your parents' relationships, and you said it's kind of all over the map, but I love that it gives you such a eclectic look at the mind of another person, and it's quite intimate as well. I mean, you're talking about stuff that's obviously deeply personal in some instances. So it's like a really cool, and it's kind of ironic. I don't know if you did this on purpose, but the window, it's like a window into your mind. And I felt like after I read it, I knew you so well, even though, our interactions have just been on Facebook. I was like, man, do you feel kind of exposed writing something like that? Is it hard to be kind of vulnerable and open with who knows who's going to read this, right? I mean, was that
Well,
challenging for you?
well, yes and no. I mean, Nietzsche has another real, I love this. We only have words for things that are already dead in our hearts.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
and,
Oh, Nietzsche, go home. You're drunk.
It's a little, it's a little bit extreme, but
yeah.
some of the stuff that I wrote, that I put in there is probably always going to be raw, a little bit. But I figure, and I figure that there's a lot more fear maybe about, exposure of our innards out there than we need as a culture here in America. Although, I've been in other cultures where people are even more resistant. Here we got Oprah, we got people coming and blabbing, Jerry Springer, that's the low end, where people just kind of, unveil everything without any kind of filters. I hope I didn't veer that far.
No.
But I do think that there's a lot of value in having people come forward and kind of bare their souls a little bit and expose where their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities are, as a way of encouraging others to kind of, relax a little bit, because that's the only way, I think, forward for most of us, if we want to have fuller lives, is to kind of go through those areas, the Achilles heel that's always being, shielded and protected, because that's usually the way, Carl Jung talks about the inferior function, it's the part of us which, is the least exercised part. For some people, it's their feelings that are repressed, and they just can't allow themselves to feel because it's just too painful. Other people, it's thinking. They can't be taxed with having to think about things for very long, because it's just either too much of an exertion, or because their thinking leads them directly to painful feelings.
Right.
And but when it's through that doorway, I think, those intimate areas that we're either maybe ashamed of, or that we feel are going to expose us to the most, ridicule or maybe malice from people. I mean, on Facebook, I've got, every once in a while, people recognize that I'm kind of unveiling something, and they go right after it like with daggers.
How dare you?
I know.
How dare you reveal that? And it's something that's in them, obviously, and that they're not even ready to address, right? Yeah. Triggers.
But I think it's stupid to go out and just basically think that, by exposing all your weaknesses or something, publicly, that's going to be therapeutic. I think that's probably really dumb. So I think that in my own case, I was probably ready to share that level of personal, vulnerability or weakness or stupidity or whatever it was, publicly, knowing that it was going to draw fire and I'd be able to take it, But I think that's what gets a good conversation going. When I used to host discussion groups, I'd like to do it again when the circumstances are right. But those were always the best discussions, when people would walk in, they're all there with their egos and everybody's full of knowledge and learning. And then we'd get enough wine in us, and when somebody would open up and expose something, and then everybody would kind of go, whoo, and then the whole tenor of the meeting would become much more respectful in a weird way, because everybody's ego was now kind of invited to kind of calm down and open up to a deeper level. And those were incredibly, and they weren't even planned that way. They were not intended to be like therapeutic or group therapy or something. But it turned out to be like that because one or two of us opened that door. And I think that can happen. It happens on my Facebook page every once in a while, not every day, but every once in a while, you get something really rich with, that kind of quality. So anyway.
Well, it certainly happens with this book. I mean, reading through it, there are, first of all, there are times where, you were posing very thought-provoking questions. But one of the things that I noticed, and I read a few passages to some friends of mine, I had a friend who is going through some troubles where, old friends of hers, they're growing apart. And you had this one this one passage that I read to her, and I think it was the one you wrote a letter to a friend of yours, and it was the bridge analogy.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God. I read that to her and she was like, that's it. That's exactly how I feel. It was like you had captured her situation and her feelings around it perfectly. And I think a lot of people, myself included, as we're reading through this, you're sharing experiences that we can all resonate with, that we all are like, yes, I felt that before. I've experienced that. But you put it into words in a way that I could never do. I mean, you are very gifted with the English language, my friend. So kudos to you. I mean, this is some of the passages in here are like, it's art. I mean, it's not just journal entries. It's something to behold.
Well, I'm glad it spoke to you, and I hope it speaks to others. But I feel like it connects me better with others too by writing it. And I felt it was a real privilege to be able to write this and to feel like it opens me up to my fellow humans more closely, because like a lot of people nowadays, I felt a little isolated and maybe marginalized by the kind of experiences that I was having and the criticisms I had of my culture, and I knew I could only voice those things to people who weren't going to bite my head off,
Right.
And you have to keep doing that, until you I guess develop the toughness you need, to go public like that,
Mm-hmm.
But I think artists don't really have a choice. They're pushed that way, aren't they?
Well, I mean, I think that's what art is, right? You're taking something that is within you and you're putting it out there in a song, in a painting, in a novel, whatever it is.
Hide it. You can't hide it.
The whole purpose of art is to bring it out there, right? I mean, yeah, you're
Sure.
compelled to do it. So yeah, but I mean, it still takes courage and it's still commendable. I mean, especially it's one thing to paint a portrait or to do a painting. It's another thing to address the stuff directly as you do in your book. And then to tie it all in, like you said, with Ramana Maharshi and Carl Jung and Nietzsche and all these other things that, I mean, I'm familiar with some of these and some more than others, but it's also educational for people, because for some people, maybe they don't know anything about Jung, or maybe maybe they know very little. And all of a sudden here you are not only talking about it, but you're tying it into real life stuff that you've been through. And so, yeah, it just gives it far more depth and value, I think, when you do it this way.
Well, if it inspires other people to study those guys, then I feel like I've done a service to those thinkers.
Yeah.
Or saints or mystics or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the lines are blurry when you get to that kind of stuff, even psychology, philosophy, spirituality, we're all they're all dealing with the same sphere, right? The psyche.
The same permanent questions.
Yeah, exactly. The big questions. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I mean, we're at an hour, just past an hour now, so I don't want to take up more of your time. And I know my kids are probably right at the door waiting for me to get done with this.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I appreciate the privilege here to
oh yeah, it was privilege was all mine. Definitely my pleasure. And I would love to chat with you again, because there's so many different topics that this was just kind of the introduction. So if you ever want to do this again, I would love to.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. Well, let's connect again and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
You too.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.